The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. Lecture 4: The Human Ego, His Freedom and Immortality. Part 2. This view of the matter raises a very important question. We have seen that the ego is not something rigid. It organizes itself in time and is formed and disciplined by its own experience. It is further clear that streams of causality flow into it from nature and from it to nature. Does the ego then determine its own activity? If so, how is the self-determination of the ego related to the determinism of the spatio-temporal order? Is personal causality a special kind of causality or only a disguised form of the mechanism of nature? It is claimed that the two kinds of determinism are not mutually exclusive and that the scientific method is equally applicable to human action. The human act of deliberation is understood to be a conflict of motives which are conceived not as the ego's own present or inherited tendencies of action or inaction, but as so many external forces fighting one another, gladiator like, on an arena of the mind. Yet the final choice is regarded as a fact determined by the strongest force and not by the resultant of contending motives, like a purely physical effect. I am, however, firmly of the opinion that the controversy between the advocates of mechanism and freedom arises from a wrong view of intelligent action, which modern psychology, unmindful of its own independence as a science, possessing a special set of facts to observe, was bound to take on account of its lavish imitation of physical sciences. The view that ego activity is a succession of thoughts and ideas, ultimately resolvable to units of sensations, is only another form of atomic materialism, which forms the basis of modern science. Such a view could not but raise a strong presumption in favor of a mechanistic interpretation of consciousness. There is, however, some relief in thinking that the new German psychology, known as configuration psychology, may succeed in securing the independence of psychology as a science, just as the theory of emergent evolution may eventually bring about the independence of biology. The newer German psychology teaches us that a certain study of intelligent behavior discloses the fact of insight over and above the mere succession of sensations. This insight is the ego's appreciation of temporal, spatial, and causal relation of things, the choice, that is to say, of data, in a complex whole, in view of the goal or purpose which the ego has set before itself for the time being. It is this sense of striving in the experience of purposive action and the success which I actually achieve in reaching my ends that convince me of my efficiency as a personal cause. The essential feature of a purposive act is its vision of a future situation, which does not appear to admit any explanation in terms of physiology. The truth is that the causal chain wherein we try to find a place for the ego is itself an artificial construction of the ego for its own purposes. The ego is called upon to live in a complex environment, and he cannot maintain his life in it without reducing it to a system which would give him some kind of assurance as to the behavior of things around him. The view of his environment as a system of cause and effect is thus an indispensable instrument of the ego and not a final expression of nature of reality. Indeed, in interpreting nature in this way, the ego understands the masters and its environment and thereby acquires and amplifies its freedom. Thus, the element of guidance and directive control in the ego's activity clearly show that the ego is a free personal casualty. He shares in the life and freedom of the ultimate ego, who, by permitting the emergence of the finite ego capable of private initiative, has limited this freedom of his own free will. This freedom of conscious behavior follows from the view of ego activity, which the Quran takes. There are verses which are unmistakably clear on this point and say, "The truth is from your Lord. Let him then who will believe, and let him who will be an unbeliever." 1829. If ye do well to your own behoof, will ye do well, and if ye do evil against yourselves, will ye do it. 17:7. Indeed, Islam recognizes a very important fact of human psychology, that is the rise and the fall of the power to act freely, and is anxious to retain the power to act freely as a constant and undiminished factor in the life of the ego. The timing of the daily prayer, which, according to the Quran, restores self-possession to the ego by bringing it into closer touch with the ultimate source of life and freedom, is intended to save the ego from the mechanizing effects of sleep and business. Prayer in Islam is the ego's escape from mechanism to freedom. It cannot, however, be denied that the idea of destiny runs throughout the Quran. This point is worth considering, more especially because Spengler, in his Decline of the West, seems to think that Islam amounts to a complete negation of the ego. I have already explained to you my view of Dir, destiny, as we find it in the Quran. As Spengler himself points out, there are two ways of making the world our own. The one is intellectual, the other, for want of a better expression, we may call vital. The intellectual way consists in understanding the world as a rigid system of cause and effect. The vital is the absolute acceptance of the inevitable necessity of life, regarded as a whole, which in evolving its inner richness creates serial time. This vital way of appropriating the universe is what the Quran describes as Iman. Iman is not merely a passive belief in one or more propositions of a certain kind. It is living assurance begotten of a rare experience. Strong personalities alone are capable of rising to this experience and the higher fatalism implied in it. Napoleon is reported to have said, "I am a thing, not a person." This is one way in which unitive experience expresses itself. In the history of religious experience in Islam, which, according to the Prophet, consists in the creation of divine attributes in man, this experience has found expression in such phrases as, "I am the creative truth," "I am time," "I am the speaking Quran," "Glory to me." In the higher Sufism of Islam, cognitive experience is not the finite ego effacing its own identity by some sort of absorption into the infinite ego. It is rather the infinite passing into the loving embrace of the finite, as Remy says. Divine knowledge is lost in the knowledge of the saint. And how is it possible for people to believe in such a thing? The fatalism implied in this attitude is not negation of the ego as Spengler seems to think. It is life and boundless power which recognizes no obstruction and can make a man calmly offer his prayers when bullets are showering around him. But it is not true, you will say, that a most degrading type of fatalism has prevailed in the world of Islam for many centuries. This is true and has a history behind it which requires separate treatment. It is sufficient here to indicate that the kind of fatalism which the European critics of Islam sum up in the word kismat was due partly to philosophical thought, partly to political expediency, and partly to the gradually diminishing force of life impulse which Islam originally imparted to the followers. Philosophy, searching for the meaning of cause as applied to God, and taking time as the essence of the relation between cause and effect, could not but reach the notion of a transcendent God prior to the universe and operating upon it from without. God was thus conceived as the last link in the chain of causation and consequently the real author of all that happens in the universe. Now, the practical materialism of the opportunist Umayyad rulers of Damascus needed a peg on which to hang their misdeeds at Karbala and to secure the fruits of Amir Muawiyah's revolt against the possibilities of a popular rebellion. Ma'bad is reported to have said to Asan of Ba'ara that the Umayyads killed Muslims and attributed their acts to the decrees of God. These enemies of God, replied Asan, are liars. Thus arose, in spite of open protests by Muslim divines, a morally degrading fatalism and the constitutional theory known as the accomplished fact in order to support vested interests. This is not at all surprising. In our own times, philosophers have furnished a kind of intellectual justification for the finality of the present capitalistic structure of society. Hegel's view of reality as an infinitude of reason from which follows the essential rationality of the real, and Auguste Comte's society as an organism in which specific functions are eternally assigned to each organ are instances in point. The same thing appears to have happened in Islam. But since Muslims have always sought the justification of their varying attitudes in the Quran, even though at the expense of its plain meaning, the fatalistic interpretation has had very far reaching effects on Muslim peoples. I could, in this connection, quote several instances of obvious misinterpretation, but the subject requires special treatment, and it is time now to turn to the question of immortality. No age has produced so much literature on the question of immortality as our own, and this literature is continually increasing in spite of the victories of modern materialism. Purely metaphysical arguments, however, cannot give us a positive belief in personal immortality. In the history of Muslim thought, Ibn Rushd approached the question of immortality from a purely metaphysical point of view, and I venture to think achieved no result. He drew a distinction between sense and intelligence, probably because of the expressions nafs and ruh used in the Quran. These expressions apparently suggesting a conflict between two opposing principles in man have misled many a thinker in Islam. However, if Ibn Rushd's dualism was based on the Quran, then I am afraid he was mistaken. For the word nafs does not seem to have been used in the Quran in any technical sense of the kind imagined by Muslim theologians. Intelligence, according to Ibn Rushd, is not a form of the body. It belongs to a different order of being and transcends individuality. It is therefore one universal and eternal. This obviously means that since unitary intellect transcends individuality, its appearance as so many unities in the multiplicity of human persons is a mere illusion. The eternal unity of intellect may mean, as Renan thinks, the everlastingness of humanity and civilization. It does not surely mean personal immortality. In fact, Ibn Rushd's view looks like William James's suggestion of a transcendental mechanism of consciousness which operates on a physical medium for a while and then gives it up in pure sport. In modern times, the line of argument for personal immortality is on the whole ethical. But ethical arguments such as that of Kant and the modern revisions of his arguments depend on a kind of faith in the fulfillment of the claims of justice, or in the irreplaceable and unique work of man as an individual pursuer of infinite ideals. With Kant, immortality is beyond the scope of speculative reason. It is a postulate of practical reason, an axiom of man's moral consciousness. Man demands and pursues the supreme good which comprises both virtue and happiness. But virtue and happiness, duty and inclination are, according to Kant, heterogeneous notions. Their unity cannot be achieved within the narrow span of the pursuer's life in this sensible world. We are therefore driven to postulate immortal life for the person's progressive completion of the unity of the mutually exclusive notions of virtue and happiness, and the existence of God eventually to effectuate this confluence. It is not clear, however, why the consummation of virtue and happiness should take infinite time, and how God can effectuate the confluence between mutually exclusive notions. This inconclusiveness of metaphysical arguments has led many thinkers to confine themselves to meeting the objections of modern materialism, which rejects immortality, holding that consciousness is merely a function of the brain and therefore ceases with the cessation of the brain process. William James thinks that this objection to immortality is valid only if the function in question is taken to be productive. The mere fact that certain mental changes vary concomitantly with certain bodily changes does not warrant the inference that mental changes are produced by bodily changes. The function is not necessarily productive. It may be permissive or transmissive, like the function of the trigger of a crossbow or that of a reflecting lens. This view, which suggests that our inner life is due to the operation in us of a kind of transcendental mechanism of consciousness, somehow choosing a physical medium for a short period of sport, does not give us any assurance of the continuance of the content of our actual experience. I have already indicated in these lectures the proper way to meet materialism. Science must necessarily select for study certain specific aspects of reality only and exclude others. It is pure dogmatism on the part of science to claim that the aspects of reality selected by it are the only aspects to be studied. No doubt, man has a spatial aspect, but this is not the only aspect of man. There are other aspects of man, such as evaluation, the unitary character of purposive experience, and the pursuit of truth, which science must necessarily exclude from its study, and the understanding of which requires categories other than those employed by science. There is, however, in the history of modern thought, one positive view of immortality. I mean, Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence. This view deserves some consideration, but only because Nietzsche has maintained it with a prophetical fervor, but only because it reveals a real tendency in the modern mind. The idea occurred to several minds about the time when it came to Nietzsche, like a poetic inspiration, and the germs of it are also found in Herbert Spencer. It was really the power of the idea rather than its logical demonstration that appealed to this modern prophet. This, in itself, is some evidence of the fact that positive views of ultimate things are the work rather of inspiration than metaphysics. However, Nietzsche has given his doctrine the form of a reasoned out theory, and as such, I think we are entitled to examine it. The doctrine proceeds on the assumption that the quantity of energy in the universe is constant and consequently finite. Space is only a subjective form. There is no meaning in saying that the world is in space in the sense that it is situated in an absolute empty void. In his view of time, however, Nietzsche parts company with Kant and Schopenhauer. Time is not a subjective form. It is a real and infinite process which can be conceived only as periodic. Thus, it is clear that there can be no dissipation of energy in an infinite empty space. The centers of this energy are limited in number and their combination perfectly calculable. There is no beginning or end of this ever active energy, no equilibrium, no first or last change. Since time is infinite, therefore, all possible combinations of energy centers have already been exhausted. There is no new happening in the universe. Whatever happens now has happened before an infinite number of times and will continue to happen an infinite number of times in the future. On Nietzsche's view, the order of happenings in the universe must be fixed and unalterable. For since an infinite time has passed, the energy centers must have, by this time, formed certain definite modes of behavior. The real word recurrence implies this fixity. Further, we must conclude that a combination of energy centers which has once taken place must always return. Otherwise, there would be no guarantee for the return even of the Superman. Everything has returned, Sirius and the spider, and thy thoughts at this moment and this last thought of thine, that all things will return. Fellow man, your whole life, like a sand glass, will always be reversed and will ever run out again. This ring in which you are but again will glitter afresh forever. Such is Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. It is only a more rigid kind of mechanism based not on an ascertained fact, but only on a working hypothesis of science. Nor does Nietzsche seriously grapple with the question of time. He takes it objectively and regards it merely as an infinite series of events returning to itself over and over again. Now, time, regarded as a perpetual circular movement, makes immortality absolutely intolerable. Nietzsche himself feels this and describes his doctrine not as one of immortality but rather as a view of life which would make immortality endurable. And what makes immortality bearable according to Nietzsche? It is the expectation that a recurrence of the combination of energy centers which constitutes my personal existence is a necessary factor in the birth of that ideal combination, which he calls Superman. But the Superman has been an infinite number of times before. His birth is inevitable. How can the prospect give me any aspiration? We can aspire only for what is absolutely new, and the absolutely new is unthinkable on Nietzsche's view, which is nothing more than a fatalism worse than the one summed up in the word Kismat. Such a doctrine, far from keying up the human organism for the fight of life, tends to destroy its action tendencies and relaxes the tension of the ego. Passing now to the teaching of the Quran. The Quranic view of the destiny of man is partially ethical, partly biological. I say partly biological because the Quran makes in this connection certain statements of a biological nature, which we cannot understand without a deeper insight into the nature of life. It mentions, for instance, the fact of barzakh, a state perhaps of some kind of suspense between death and resurrection. Resurrection too appears to have been differently conceived. The Quran does not base its possibility, like Christianity, on the evidence of actual resurrection of an historic person. It seems to take and argue resurrection as a universal phenomenon of life, in some sense, true even of the birds and the animals. 638. Before, however, we take the details of Quranic doctrine of personal immortality, we must note three things which are perfectly clear from the Quran and regarding which there is or ought to be no difference in opinion. Number one, that the ego has a beginning in time and did not pre-exist its emergence in the spatio-temporal order. This is clear from the verse which I cited a few minutes ago. Number two, that according to the Quranic view, there is no possibility of return to this earth. This is clear from the following verses. When death overtaketh one of them, he saith, Lord, send me back again, that I may do the good that I have left undone. By no means these are the very words which he shall speak, but behind them is a barrier, barzakh, until the day when they shall be raised again. 23:99-100. And by the moon, when at her full, that from state to state shall ye be surely carried onwards. 84:18-19. The germs of life, is it ye who create them, or are we their creator? It is we who have decreed that death should be among you. Yet we are not thereby hindered from replacing you with others, yours likes, or from creating you again in forms which ye know not. 56:58-61. Number 3. The finitude is not a misfortune. Verily there is none in the heavens and in the earth but shall approach the God of mercy as a servant. He hath taken note of them and numbered them with exact numbering, and each of them shall come to him on the day of resurrection as a single individual. 19:93-95. This is a very important point and must be properly understood with a view to secure a clear insight into the Islamic theory of salvation. It is with the irreplaceable singleness of his individuality that the finite ego will approach the infinite ego to see for himself the consequences of his part action and to judge the possibilities of his future. And every man's fate have we fastened about his neck, and on the day of resurrection will we bring forthwith to him a book which shall be proffered to him wide open. Read thy book. There needeth none but thyself to make out an account against thee this day. 17:13-14. Whatever may be the final fate of man, it does not mean the loss of individuality. The Quran does not contemplate complete liberation from finitude as the highest state of human bliss. The unceasing reward of man consists in his gradual growth in self-possession, in uniqueness and intensity of his activity as an ego. Even the scene of universal destruction immediately preceding the day of judgment cannot affect the perfect calm of a full-grown ego. And there shall be a blast on the trumpet, and all who are in the heavens and all who are in the earth shall faint away, save those in whose case God wills otherwise. 39:68. Who can be the subject of this exception but those in whom the ego has reached the highest point of intensity? And the climax of this development is reached when the ego is able to retain full self-possession. Even in the case of a direct contact with all-embracing ego, as the Quran says of the Prophet's vision of the ultimate ego, his eye turned not aside, nor did it wander. 53:17. This is the ideal of perfect manhood in Islam. Nowhere has it found a better literary expression than a Persian verse speaks of the Holy Prophet's experience of divine illumination. Moses fainted away by a mere surface illumination of reality. Thou seest the very substance of reality with a smile. Pantheistic Sufism obviously cannot favor such a view and suggests difficulty of a philosophical nature. How can the infinite and the finite egos mutually exclude each other? Can the finite ego, as such, returns its finitude besides the infinite ego? This difficulty is based on a misunderstanding of the true nature of the infinite. True infinity does not mean infinite extension, which cannot be conceived without embracing all available finite extensions. Its nature consists in intensity and not extensity. And the moment we fixed our gaze on intensity, we begin to see that the finite ego must be distinct, though not isolated from the infinite. Extensively regarded, I am absorbed by the spatio-temporal order to which I belong. Intensively regarded, I consider the same spatio-temporal order as a confronting other, wholly alien to me. I am distinct from and yet intimately related to that on which I depend for my life and sustenance. With these 3 points clearly grasped, the rest of the doctrine is easy to conceive. It is open to man, according to the Quran, to belong to the meaning of the universe and become immortal. Thinketh man that he shall be left as a thing of no use? Was he not a mere embryo? Then he became thick blood of which God formed him and fashioned him and made him twain, male and female. Is God not powerful enough to quicken the dead? 36 to 40. It is highly improbable that a being whose evolution has taken millions of years should be thrown away as a thing of no use. But it is only as an ever growing ego that he can belong to the meaning of the universe. By the soul, and he who hath balanced it, and hath shown to it the ways of wickedness and piety. Blessed is he who hath made it grow, and undone is he who hath corrupted it. 91, 7 to 9. And how to make the soul grow and save it from corruption? By action. Blessed be he in whose hand is the kingdom, and over all things is he potent, who hath created death and life to test which of you is the best in point of deed, and he is the mighty and forgiving. 67, 1 to 2. Life offers a scope for ego activity, and death is the first test of synthetic activity of the ego. There are no pleasure giving and pain giving acts. There are only ego sustaining and ego dissolving acts. It is the deed that prepares the ego for dissolution or disciplines him for a future career. The principle of the ego sustaining deed is respect for the ego in myself as well as in others. Personal immortality, then, is not ours as of right. It is to be achieved by personal effort. Man is only a candidate for it. The most depressing error of materialism is the supposition that finite consciousness exhausts its object. Philosophy and science are only one way of approaching that object. There are other ways of approach open to us, and death, if present action has sufficiently fortified the ego against the shock that physical dissolution brings, is only a kind of passage of what the Quran describes as barzakh. The record of the Sufistic experience indicate that barzakh is a state of consciousness characterized by a change in the ego's attitude towards time and space. There is nothing improbable in it. It was Helmholtz who first discovered that nervous excitation takes place to reach consciousness. If this is so, our present psychological structure is at the bottom of our present view of time. And if the ego survives the dissolution of this structure, a change in our attitude towards time and space seems perfectly natural. Nor is such a change wholly unknown to us. The enormous condensation of impressions which occurs in our dream life and the exaltation of memory which sometimes takes place at the moment of death disclose the ego's capacity for different standards of time. The state of barzakh, therefore, does not seem to be merely a passive state of expectation. It is a state in which the ego catches a glimpse of fresh aspects of reality and prepares himself for adjustments to these aspects. It must be a state of great psychic unhingement, especially in the case of full grown egos who have naturally developed fixed modes of operation on a specific spatio-temporal order, and may mean dissolution to less fortunate ones. However, the ego must continue to struggle until he is able to gather himself up and win his resurrection. The resurrection, therefore, is not an external event. It is the consummation of a life process within the ego. Whether individual or universal, it is nothing more than a kind of stock taking of the ego's past achievements and this future possibilities. The Quran argues the phenomenon of re-emergence of the ego on the analogy of his first emergence. Man saith, "What, after I am dead, shall I in the end be brought forth alive? Doth not man bear in mind that we made him at first when he was not?" 1966 to 67. It is we who have decreed that death should be among you. Yet we are not thereby hindered from replacing you with others, your likes, or from producing you in a form which ye know not. Ye have known the first creation. Will ye not reflect? 56, 60 to 62. How did man first emerge? This suggestive argument embodied in the last verses of the two passages quoted above did in fact open a new vista to Muslim philosophers. It was Hayes, Death 255 AH, who first hinted at the changes in animal life caused by migrations and environment generally. The association known as the Brethren of Purity further amplified the views of Jahais. Ibn Qawi, however, was the first Muslim thinker to give a clear and, in many respects, thoroughly modern theory of the origin of man. It was only natural and perfectly consistent with the spirit of the Quran that Ramey regarded the question of immortality as one of biological evolution and not a problem to be decided by arguments of purely metaphysical nature, as some philosophers of Islam had thought. The theory of evolution, however, has brought despair and anxiety instead of hope and enthusiasm for life to the modern world. The reason is to be found in unwarranted modern assumption that man's present structure, mental as well as psychological and physiological, is the last word in biological evolution, and that death, regarded as a biological event, has no constructive meaning. The world of today needs a Ramey to create an attitude of hope and to kindle the fire of enthusiasm for life. His imitable lines may be quoted here. First, man appeared in the class of inorganic things. Next, he passed therefrom into that of plants. For years, he lived as one of the plants, remembering not of his inorganic state so different. And when he passed from the vegetative to the animal state, he had no remembrance of his state as plant, except the inclination he felt to the world of plants, especially at the time of spring and sweet flowers, like the inclination of infants towards their mothers, which know not the cause of their inclination to the breast. Again, the great Creator as you know, drew man out of the animal into the human state. Thus, man passed from one order of nature to another, till he became wise and knowing and strong as he is now. Of his first souls, he has now no remembrance, and he will be again changed from his present soul. The point, however, which has caused much difference of opinion among Muslim philosophers and theologians is whether the re-emergence of man involves the re-emergence of his former physical medium. Most of them, including Shah Waliullah, the last great theologian of Muslim world, are inclined to think that it does involve at least some kind of physical medium suitable to the ego's new environment. It seems to me that this view is mainly due to the fact that the ego as an individual is inconceivable without some kind of local reference or empirical background. The following verses, however, throw some light on the point. What, when dead and turned to dust, shall we rise again? Remote is such a return. Now know we what the earth consumeth of them, and with us is a book in which account is kept. 50:3-4. To my mind, these verses clearly suggest that the nature of the universe is such that it is open to it to maintain in some way or another the kind of individuality necessary for the final working out of human action, even after the disintegration of what appears to specify his individuality in the present environment. What that other way is, we do not know, nor do we gain any further insight into the nature of the second creation by associating it with some kind of body, however subtle it may be. The analogies of the Quran only suggest it as a fact. They are not meant to reveal its nature and character. Philosophically speaking, therefore, we cannot go farther than this, that in view of the past history of man, it is highly improbable that his career should come to an end with the dissolution of his body. However, according to the teachings of the Quran, the ego's re-emergence brings him a sharp sight. 50:22, whereby he clearly sees his self-built fate fastened round his neck. Heaven and hell are states, not localities. Their descriptions in the Quran are visible representations of an inner fact, that is, character. Hell, in the words of the Quran, is God's kindled fire which mounts above the hearts, the painful realization of one's failure as a man. Heaven is the joy of triumph over the forces of disintegration. There is no such thing as eternal damnation in Islam. The word eternity used in certain verses relating to hell is explained by the Quran itself to mean only a period of time. 78:23. Time cannot be wholly irrelevant to the development of personality. Character tends to become permanent. Its reshaping must require time. Hell, therefore, as conceived by the Quran, is not a pit of everlasting torture inflicted by a revengeful God. It is a corrective experience which may make a hardened ego once more sensitive to the living breeze of divine grace. Nor is heaven a holiday. Life is one and continuous. Man marches always onwards to receive ever fresh illuminations from the infinite reality, which every moment appears in a new glory. And the recipient of divine illumination is not merely a passive recipient. Every act of a free ego creates a new situation and thus offers further opportunities of creative unfolding.